This channel is part of the History Hit network.
On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
At 8 a.m. local time on Sunday the 7th of December 1941, 171 Japanese bombers and dive bombers, armed with high explosives and torpedoes, escorted by 43 fighters, attacked the American Pacific Fleet in its base at Pearl Harbor and nearby airfields on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. A second wave of 124 bombers and 36 fighters arrived 40 minutes later. When the dust settled, 2,403 Americans were dead or missing, another 1,178 wounded, including 103 civilian casualties. The attackers lost 29 of their 384 aircraft. 7 of the 8 battleships at anchor and in dry dock were sunk or disabled. 5 of the 6 airfields devastated. 65 aircraft destroyed on the ground.
The Japanese used basically 3 types of aircraft in the attack on Pearl Harbor. The first one was the fighter, the Zero fighter, which was faster than any Allied fighter at the time, had 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns. It was, as I say, very fast, 350 miles per hour. Its aim was to protect the bombers as they came in and also to strafe the airfields and the ships in the harbour. The second aircraft they used was the Val dive bomber. That had a speed of 266 miles an hour and carried a bomb load of 800 pounds, just over 800 pounds. The third type that they used was the Kate. Now that was the name that the Allies gave to the aircraft, and that was an aircraft which could be used either as a torpedo bomber or as a level bomber. It could carry 1 torpedo or the equivalent amount in tonnage, which was 800 pounds.
The United States was outraged. Next day, addressing Congress, President Roosevelt referred to December the 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. And on the streets, angry citizens called for revenge. 18 months earlier, after the surrender of France, only 15% had favored war. At a stroke, the USA became a united, not divided country. Industrial disputes were called off as workers patriotically resumed work and young men flocked to the recruiting offices. Japanese nationals were rounded up and interned. Gone was all thought of isolationism and the hope widely expressed in newspapers only that morning of continuing peace. So alarmed were West Coast communities that a Los Angeles radio station warned its listeners about impending invasion. The mayor of San Francisco declared a state of emergency, and the governor of California called out the National Guard.
Well, my brother and I we had an apartment together, and we were down a little corner drugstore in Santa Monica that Sunday morning. I don't know, it was about 10 o'clock, 10:30 in the morning. And all of a sudden over the radio, here come the news that they were bombing Pearl Harbor. And boy, I tell you, all hell broke loose. First, we couldn't believe it. But I'll tell you, by the next morning and the morning after, they had sandbags, machine guns set up on practically all the intersections in Santa Monica, particularly around the Douglas aircraft plant, to protect it, because we all knew at that time we'd have made book that the Japanese rumors were out, like they always are, that the Japanese were about to invade the West Coast. And we were all just sure we'd get up the next morning and we're going to see Japanese soldiers running up and down the streets in Santa Monica.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. From the Battle of Trafalgar and the Revolutionary era, right through to the Second World War. If you are looking for your next military history fix, then this is the service for you. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and War Stories fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code WARSTORIES at checkout.
It soon became evident that Pearl Harbor had not suffered alone. Thailand, British Malaya and Hong Kong had been invaded. American bases in the Philippines, on Guam, Wake, and Midway Islands bombed. The main Japanese aim was domination of Southeast Asia, to secure the area's natural resources, especially oil. The preemptive strike on the Pacific Fleet was an attempt to prevent American interference before that conquest had been completed, and allow time for an effective defensive cordon to be established. In England, Winston Churchill reflected that the USA was like a gigantic boiler. Once the fire is lit under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. How right he would be. The Japanese strategy was the brainchild of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the fleet. He believed that the United States, with her own Southeast Asian commercial and territorial interests, must become involved in any war, and that to strike first would be Japan's best option. An advantageous, negotiated peace might then follow.
Admiral Yamamoto had become CNC, the Japanese Combined Fleet, in 1939, and at the time of Pearl Harbor was age 57. He was a leading naval strategist, in fact the leading Japanese naval strategist, who'd had experience in the United States. He'd been to Harvard, and he'd also been the naval attaché in Washington. So he'd studied, therefore, the American methods, and in particular was interested in aircraft carriers and the development of aircraft carriers. He knew what the strength of the Americans was, and he therefore initially opposed the war. Once it was be decided upon, he put his whole heart behind the Pearl Harbor project.
In his belief that a swift aerial assault on Pearl Harbor to cripple the American fleet offered the best chance of success, Yamamoto was encouraged by the daring attack of British carrier-based Swordfish on Taranto Harbor in November 1940, which sank 3 Italian battleships and effectively destroyed the Italian Mediterranean fleet.
In June 1940, when the Italians came into the war, it looked as if the Italian Navy was going to dominate the Mediterranean. The British decided they would have to take out the Italian fleet if at all possible. And on the 11th, 12th of November, during the night, they launched an attack by Swordfish aircraft from HMS Illustrious. They launched it from 170 miles southeast of Taranto, and it took the aircraft 2.5 hours to get there. But when they arrived, they sank 3 battleships and only lost 2 Swordfish. And the important lesson as far as the Japanese were concerned was that it was a very shallow harbour. So not only did they attack ships in harbour, they attacked them in a shallow harbour.
Having overcome opposition, not least from Admiral Nagano, Chief of the Naval Staff, and Admiral Nagumo, who would command the task force against Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto delegated preparation of the attack to Commander Minoru Genda. Development of a modified aerial torpedo, suitable for use in shallow water, and special training for air crews went ahead before Genda had finalized his operational plan.
Commander Genda was the person given the responsibility of planning the attack on Pearl Harbor. In 1941, he was 37. He'd had experience of being the assistant naval attaché in London, and therefore he knew a lot about the development of aircraft carriers and torpedo bombers. In particular, he was interested in the Taranto operation. He therefore studied that very closely and derived from that not only the idea of attacking with a surprise attack on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, but also the need to develop a special torpedo which would be effective at a shallow depth. So not only did he plan the operation, but he was very much involved in developing the torpedo which carried out the attack.
On the 26th of November 1941, Nagumo set sail for the Kuril Islands of northeastern Japan, in command of 6 aircraft carriers and 2 battleships, with 12 escorting cruisers and destroyers and 8 tankers. His 12-day passage to the point where the aircraft would be launched, 275 miles north of Pearl Harbor, was conveniently masked by storms and fog. Ahead, an advanced expeditionary force of 27 submarines carrying 5 additional midget submarines was already closing on Oahu. With hindsight, the Americans had several indications that something was afoot. But intelligence data requires correlation and accurate interpretation to be effective. Above all, the will to believe the unthinkable. Governed by its policy of international detachment after the bloodletting of the First World War and a long-standing aversion to overseas entanglements which could be traced through Presidents Monroe and Jefferson to George Washington, politicians and military leaders were still psychologically attuned to peace. Although contact was lost by radio interception stations with the Japanese carriers due to an unexpected change in their call signs, American intelligence sources concluded that they were still in home waters. At worst, they might be on their way to attack the Soviet maritime provinces northwest of Japan, or British and Dutch colonies in the south. No special efforts were made, therefore, to identify more precisely potential anti-American activity, except to note vulnerability of the Philippines. And Nagumo's warships went undetected. 3,400 miles from Japan, Pearl Harbor seemed secure. Evidence of Japanese mini-submarine activity off Oahu and radar reports of a large formation of approaching aircraft immediately prior to the surprise aerial attack were not taken seriously. In the relaxed atmosphere of the weekend, it was easy to believe that an expected force of B-17 bombers from the American mainland or aircraft from the carrier Enterprise off the Hawaiian coast were coming in to land. When Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was informed that the Japanese are attacking Pearl Harbor and this is no drill, he was dumbfounded. Like the Army commander, Lieutenant General Walter Short, he had never envisaged such an onslaught. Only sabotage by Japanese residents in the event of hostilities was considered even remotely possible.
Admiral Kim was a career officer. He'd been in the Navy 30 years and at the time of Pearl Harbor was age 59. He was not, though, experienced in aircraft carriers, and he did not believe that the Hawaiian Islands were at risk from an air attack. He didn't believe for one moment that that would happen. So therefore he was ill prepared for the attack which did happen on December 1941. He was found guilty of dereliction of duty and was removed from his post 10 days after the operation. But after the war, a congressional inquiry cleared him of that particular charge and said he'd just made an error of judgment.
The politicians and public at home had not anticipated a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor either. In shock, they quickly demanded action to avenge such a treacherous and deadly assault. Fortunately, the aircraft carriers Hornet and Enterprise had not been in harbor and survived with their aircraft. Despite damage to its shore installations, Pearl Harbor remained an operational base, and many personnel from the stricken warships were saved to fight on. On the 17th of December, Kimmel was succeeded in command of the Pacific Fleet, by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, who decided to make rapid use of his carriers by attacking Japanese-held islands to raise American civilian and military morale, which had been so severely dented.
Admiral Nimitz had joined the Navy in 1907 and had been a submariner in his early part of his career. After that, he'd become a staff officer, and in 1939, as an admiral, had been in charge of the Bureau of Navigation, which meant that he was responsible for the development of the US Navy in the period immediately before the Pearl Harbor debacle. Once he'd taken over as C&C Pacific, he made very quickly use of the carriers so that he could restore morale. He used them to attack Japanese-held islands, and he had a very good reputation for picking good subordinates, and therefore he had a good team around him.
A planned carrier-based attack on Wake Island, captured by the Japanese on the 23rd of December 1941, had to be abandoned in January 1942 for technical reasons. But on the 1st of February, Vice Admiral William F. Halsey led the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown against the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, and a month later, the Enterprise hit Wake and Marcus, fewer than 1,200 miles from Japan. On the 10th of March, aircraft from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown attacked a Japanese invasion force off New Guinea, sinking 4 ships and damaging 5 others. These were mere pinpricks, and in Washington, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of the U.S. Naval Staff, began to consider a more effective response to Pearl Harbor, an air raid on Tokyo from the American carriers. Japanese land-based aircraft were capable of operating 300 miles offshore, picket boats a further 200 miles from land. Naval aircraft could not be launched outside these ranges. To go in closer would hazard the carriers. Long-range Army Air Corps bombers might do the job, though. In January 1942, King discussed the problem with his principal staff officer, Captain Francis S. Lowe. In turn, Lowe approached Lieutenant General H.H. Arnold, Commanding General of the Army Air Forces, who enthusiastically backed the proposal. As yet, no feasibility study had been carried out. Arnold therefore tasked Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, his Director of Operational Requirements, without letting him know why, to find an aircraft which could take off in 500 feet, carry a ton of bombs, and fly 2,000 miles. A further constraint was that the takeoff area would be a mere 75 feet wide. Doolittle, aged 45, held a doctorate in aeronautical sciences, had served in the U.S. Air Service from 1917 till 1930, afterwards gaining fame for adventurous long-distance flying, besides winning the Schneider and Thompson trophy races. He had rejoined the U.S. Army's Air Arm in July 1940 and moved to Washington on Arnold's staff in December 1941.
James Harold Doolittle was born close to San Francisco but spent most of his early years at Nome in Alaska. Being a very small chap, he had to stand up for himself and quickly became a very accomplished street fighter. But at the same time, he became interested in new mechanical things. He went off to study mining engineering at Berkeley University before joining the Air Service. In the interwar period, he became very interested in the Air Service and an accomplished airman. But in 1930, he left the full-time service to join Shell Petroleum, and he's traveled the world promoting civil aviation. But when the war was at hand in 1940, he was recalled to the service at the age of 43 as a major. And of course, one of his first jobs was to plan the operation which would bear his name. Not only did he plan that operation, but being an extremely energetic man, made sure that he led it too.
Following Arnold's instruction, Doolittle discounted the Douglas B-18 and B-23, concluding that only the North American B-25 Mitchell twin-engine bomber with a wingspan of 67 feet 6 inches met the requirements.
Oh, one hell of an airplane. It came out of the war with a reputation honestly earned as being the most versatile medium bomber built by anybody in World War II. If you want to do some of that airplane, you just went ahead and done it, and it would do a fine job. In tactical training, even had a 75 millimeter cannon in the nose. It was a fine piece of weaponry. It had a terrific muzzle velocity and a flat trajectory, so they beefed up the recoil mechanism on it. It worked beautiful. We'd make runs on targets out there in the water from a mile away, and that projectile coming out of that 75 just flat. It didn't drop. It just straight on out there. But they could not get the recoil dampened down enough. And that old B-25, you'd trip off around that, and it just, you swear to God, she'd just stop in the air, you know, momentarily, and she'd shake like a dog getting out of the creek, you know, shaking off water, only in this case, the rivets are flying. They found out after about 50 or 60 rounds that they had to survey the airplane. When I say survey, that means junk it, because they were just tearing them up.
Doolittle now learnt the target and was ordered to oversee technical aspects of the operation, select and train the crews. Special Project Number 1, or First Aviation Project, had become a reality. Captain Donald B. Duncan dealt with the naval side of the mission, and in due course at Pearl Harbor he briefed Nimitz and Halsey, who would command the naval task force. Prior to sailing, only a tight-knit group of officers knew the targets. During the third week of January 1942, Doolittle arranged for a B-25B to be sent to the Mid-Continent Airline Works at Minneapolis for alterations, including fitting of an autopilot. Additional collapsible rubber fuel tanks were installed in the bomb bay and fuselage to increase the fuel capacity by 60%. The bomb racks were modified, special photographic equipment fitted. Before the operation, the lower ventral gun turret would also be removed.
B-25B bomber was ideal for the operation which became known as the Doolittle raid. The operation could only have aircraft on the aircraft carrier which had a wingspan of less than 75 feet. And this had a wingspan of just over 67 feet and a length of 52 feet. So that therefore was a good aircraft for that particular operation and was chosen by Doolittle for that reason. It had a crew of 5 with 5 machine guns. Before the operation though, 2 of those were taken out, so when the operation went ahead they only had 3 machine guns. The important thing about it was that it had a range of 2,000 miles. That would give them the opportunity of taking off from the aircraft carriers, bombing Tokyo, and as planned, go on to China, if all had gone according to plan. So the characteristics as far as the Doolittle raid were concerned was that it had the wingspan which allowed it to be on board the carriers and also had the range.
Doolittle decided that the 17th Bombardment Group, based at Pendleton, Oregon, comprising the 34th, 37th, 95th Bombing and 89th Photo Reconnaissance Squadrons, would fly the mission. Brigadier General Carl A. Spaatz, then on Arnold's staff, but a future commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, listed 10 Japanese cities with important industrial targets. On the 28th of January, Arnold disarmingly informed a White House meeting that at present a man is working on the proposition of bombing Japan from China or Russia. Need for security justified this subterfuge. On the 2nd of February, watched by Duncan, 2 B-25s took off from the Hornet off Norfolk, Virginia, proving that this maneuver was practical. Shortly afterwards, Doolittle summarized for Arnold his intention to bomb and fire the industrial center of Japan. He outlined details of the proposed bomb loads and signal procedures. Flying a bomber off the deck of a carrier was hazardous enough. Landing on it again, impossible. So the plan was to overfly Japan and land in nationalist-occupied China. Modifications to the aircraft would be completed by the 15th of March. Increasingly unfavorable weather in the target area could be expected after the end of April, so the mission must be mounted with this in mind. Doolittle ended his briefing document with the bold statement: Lieutenant Colonel J.H. Doolittle, Air Corps, will be in charge of the preparations for and will be in personal command of the project. Arnold did not immediately agree, declaring that no staff officer should expect to lead every mission which he planned. Doolittle persisted, and in mid-March eventually received Arnold's reluctant sanction. I beat it back to Elgin and hoped that Hap wouldn't order me to stay home. He never did, Doolittle recalled.
The aircraft carrier Hornet, together with Enterprise and Yorktown, were three aircraft carriers that were laid down specifically as new class aircraft carriers in 1939 and commissioned in 1941. So she was a new aircraft carrier at the time of the Doolittle raid. She had a speed of 32.5 knots, she had a tonnage of 26,000 and a crew of 2,175. She was therefore a modern aircraft carrier.
The rigorous training program eliminated 2 B-25s through irreparable damage, and 1 crew left voluntarily, leaving 22 aircraft and 23 crews. There were other problems. The added rubber fuel tanks tended to leak, and Doolittle became exasperated with the belly turret. A man could learn to play the violin good enough for Carnegie Hall before he could learn to fire this thing. Off it came, with the bonus that more fuel could be carried. The secret Norden high-level bomb site was removed and replaced by the low-level Mark Twain, devised specifically for this operation. The Mitchell's carburetors were modified to ensure maximum fuel consumption at low level, and 2 fake machine guns, painted wooden broomsticks, were placed in the tail position to deter pursuing fighters. In the 3rd week of March, a final trial took place. Shortly afterwards, Duncan wired, "Tell Jimmy to get on his horse." The Navy was ready too. Hornet on its way from the East Coast via the Panama Canal to San Francisco. Once there, on the 1st of April 1942, the B-25s were loaded onto Hornet. At 10:18 the following morning, the aircraft carrier slipped anchor, and in company with 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and a refueling tanker, left port carrying a spare aircrew and the naval liaison officer Miller, who had officially been posted back to Pensacola. A farewell telephone message from Arnold to Doolittle ended, "Goodbye, good luck, and come back safely." During the afternoon of the 3rd of April, the purpose and destination of the mission were broadcast. Hornet officially recorded that cheers from every section of the ship greeted the announcement, and morale reached a new high. The accompanying ships were told that the airmen were bound for Tokyo. Detailed briefing of the bomber crews now began, including recommended behavior if captured. How to make friends and influence the Japs, according to one cynical airman. Doolittle stressed that at all costs, bombing the Imperial Palace in Tokyo must be avoided, and strenuous efforts made to avoid residential areas. Whenever possible, the air gunners practiced on kites and free-flying balloons. The B-25s, too big to be transported in the Hornet's lifts, had to be secured in the open on the flight deck, which required constant checks to ensure that vibration had not interfered with control surfaces or made the aircraft liable to break loose in high seas. A distinct disadvantage was that to make way for the bombers, Hornet's own aircraft was stowed below, making the flotilla vulnerable to air attack, which, fortunately, did not materialize. Halsey's return flight from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor had been delayed by bad weather, so Hornet's rendezvous with his task group did not occur till the 13th of April, after which Enterprise provided air cover for the whole armada.
So when the two came together, he had 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 oilers. When he decided to carry out the operation, he sent the destroyers and the oilers back, so when the operation was launched, he had simply with him the cruisers and the 2 aircraft carriers of Task Force 16.
The operational plan called for Doolittle to take off immediately Hornet came within range of Japan, in advance of the other B-25s, to mark the Tokyo targets with incendiaries at sunset. This would allow the Mitchells ordered to attack the Japanese capital to do so after dark. The rest of the bombs would go to Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. Unknown to Halsey and Doolittle, on the 11th of April, the Chinese nationalist leader, General Chiang Kai-shek, had asked for the mission to be postponed until May, when he hoped to have captured more Japanese-held territory. So the task force sailed on eastwards, unaware that satisfactory arrangements for their arrival in China had not been completed. Negotiations were hampered by need for security and unwillingness to reveal the true nature of the mission. The most suitable airbase was Chuchao, 50 miles inland and some 1,100 miles from Tokyo. But Kuailin, Qian, Yushan, and Lishu seemed feasible alternatives. Once Halsey's carriers and cruisers had refueled 1,000 miles from Japan on the 15th of April, they left the destroyers and the tankers behind. Gusty weather interrupted the smooth operation of reconnaissance flights sent 200 miles ahead of the task force. Nevertheless, no reports of enemy vessels or aircraft were received on the 16th and 17th of April. So on the 17th of April, the B-25s were fueled and positioned for takeoff. White guidelines were painted on the deck for pilots to follow with their nose wheels and left landing gear wheel. This would ensure 6 feet clearance for the starboard wing from the carrier's superstructure. Halsey remarked, "That we're in the enemy's backyard, Jimmy. Anything can happen from here in." At 5:58 a.m. on Saturday the 18th of April, one of the aircraft covering the fleet reported enemy surface ship, 36 degrees 4 minutes north, 153 degrees 10 minutes east, bearing 276 degrees true, 42 miles. Believed sighted by the enemy. Halsey ordered an immediate alteration of course. But at 7:38 a.m., another patrol boat was visually identified by Hornet, whose radio room picked up a signal from the enemy vessel. Halsey sent the cruiser Nashville to sink the patrol boat, which, due to its low profile and heavy seas, took close to an hour and the expenditure of 938 6-inch shells. It was clear, though, that the Japanese boat had spotted the carrier. So Halsey signaled Hornet. "Launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and gallant command, good luck, and God bless you." The task force was by then 650 miles from Japan, 150 miles short of the maximum agreed launch position. To take off now would mean carrying out a daylight attack. Doolittle did not even consider the contingency plan, aborting and making for Midway. Rapidly calculating that his Mitchells would need even more fuel, he ordered an additional 10 5-gallon cans of petrol to be carried. Dinghies and survival rations were already aboard. Pessimists suggested that even now, the B-25s would run out of fuel well short of China.
Having taken off in bad weather conditions, Doolittle's 16 aircraft faced 640 miles before they got to their bombing points in Japan, and then 1,200 further miles before they got to China. In theory, this was all right because they had a maximum range of about 2,000 miles, but of course weather conditions were such that the possibility was that they were going to be in trouble with range. They flew in daylight, and the hope that they could evade detection. They had to make an accurate landfall because they had to pick up specific targets. They had been warned not to bomb civilian targets. One of the problems they had, apart from the weather and apart from the possibility of being sighted, was they had removed the under turret, so they only had 3 machine guns.
623 miles from land and 688 miles from the center of Tokyo, 35 degrees 45 minutes north, 153 degrees 40 minutes east, at 07:25, Doolittle took off with only a 467 feet run possible. Halsey reflected that there wasn't a man topside who didn't help sweat him into the air. One of his own pilots recalled, "We watched him like hawks, wondering what the wind would do to him and whether he would get off in that little run toward the bow. If he couldn't, we couldn't." Weather conditions were atrocious. With Hornet steaming into a 40-knot headwind, Halsey recorded that the wind and sea were so strong that morning that green water was breaking over the carrier's ramps. Lieutenant Edgar G. Osborne was carefully positioned on the port side of the deck with a flag to signal each aircraft to commence its run so that it took off as the deck lifted. Each takeoff was perilous and potentially fatal, from a slippery surface and with a cloud base of 1,000 feet. The Admiral wrote that one pilot hung on the brink until we nearly catalogued his effects, so close was he to disaster. This caused Miller, the liaison officer, to chalk on a board for the remaining crews to see, "Stabilizer in neutral." Every B-25 carried a crew of 5, 2 pilots, a navigator, a bombardier, and an engineer gunner, 3 500-pound bombs, and a cluster of incendiaries. The last of the 16 Mitchells took off at 08:24, and a minute later, the task force changed course, commencing retirement from the area at 25 knots. After fighting off pursuing enemy ships and aircraft, it would reach Pearl Harbor on the 25th of April, having lost 1 reconnaissance aircraft and 2 others through accidents on the way. Meanwhile, a week earlier, the B-25s had achieved complete surprise, mainly because they had the good fortune to approach Japan just after conclusion of an air raid precaution exercise. Many defenders held fire, believing them to be friendly aircraft returning to base. Doolittle wrote that after takeoff, he circled Hornet to establish his exact heading and check the compass. On his flight to Japan, he passed and endeavored to avoid various civil and naval craft until he made landfall near Inubu-shima, north of the intended spot. This would mean making an unscheduled approach to Tokyo from the north, but allow him to evade anticipated strong defenses west of the city. Hugging the ground, he dropped marker incendiaries before his high-explosive bombs. On his way to the target, Doolittle sighted 9 fighters, which were out of range, and encountered anti-aircraft fire as he turned south towards the sea after bombing. His B-25, however, was unscathed, and he reached the Chinese coast safely. Chu Chao could not be raised on the radio. With darkness closing in, the cloud ceiling down to 600 feet, and hills in the vicinity, 13 hours and 2,250 miles after taking off from Hornet, Doolittle gave the order to bail out.
Doolittle's crew crossed the Chinese coast at 1,000 feet in poor weather, but because there was hills in the area, they went up to 8,000 feet, failed to find any of the Chinese airfields which they had been briefed to look for, and at 9:30, having covered 2,250 miles, Doolittle decided they would have to abandon the aircraft, and they all bailed out. He himself spent the night hiding in a mill. 3 of his crew had been captured by guerrillas and were very lucky to get away. The 5th member of the crew had come down, injured his ankle, and had been taken into care by friendly Chinese troops. Doolittle, when the next morning, found himself in trouble because he had to convince a Chinese major that he was actually friendly. And having done that, he was taken to the centre of administration in the province and found that his other 4 crew were there. So all 5 of them came together.
Like Doolittle, skimming the rooftops and climbing only to 1,500 feet to release their bombs, the 12 other Tokyo-bound aircraft began to release their loads at 12:15 on the designated industrial plants, power stations, and munitions factories. Some would report inaccurate anti-aircraft fire and seeing a few fighters, which were fooled into keeping out of range by the dummy guns in the Mitchell's tails. The B-25 detailed for Nagoya flew through heavy fire from the ground, but was confident that it had hit its targets. So was the Kobe machine, which met no opposition at all. The bomber bound for Osaka is believed to have attacked Nagoya instead. Use of the Mitchells prompted some Japanese naval officers to insist that they must have flown directly from Midway Island. The Japanese immediately roped off the bombed areas, so that little information leaked out. They claimed that only a single hospital in Tokyo had been struck. Although it did not cause widespread destruction, which had never been possible with such a small force and limited bomb loads, the raid did hit significant targets, like the aircraft carrier Ryoho in dry dock.
Unfortunately, the Doolittle raid did cause some collateral damage. That is almost inevitable. But it also hit a diesel production factory, an aircraft factory, an army ammunition dump, a naval dockyard, and damaged an aircraft carrier which was in dock. Its amount of damage that it did, therefore, was relatively small in specific terms, but the psychological effect was immense. It thoroughly shocked the Japanese and, of course, boosted the morale of the Americans. So the effect of the raid was not necessarily one that could be gauged by the amount of damage it did, but by the psychological effect.
None of the B-25s landed safely, although a strong tailwind hurried them across the China Sea. Several of the other aircraft unknowingly flew over Chuchao in darkness, rain, and high winds. Below them, the Chinese had doused all lights and runway aids, fearing an enemy attack.
Captain Edward York, when he was on board the Hornet, found that the final servicing at Sacramento, the engineers there had changed the carburetors in his B-25. It was too late to change that now, and the result was that having taken off early, he had a problem not only with the amount of fuel, but because there was a rich mixture in the carburetors, that he used that fuel up very quickly. Having bombed in Japan, he decided he had no chance of making China, so made for the nearest, what he thought was friendly territory, and put down on an airfield 40 miles north of Vladivostok, which was in the Soviet Union. It was the only one of the 16 aircraft to make a 3-point landing. But he didn't get the joyous reception that he had hoped. He was promptly interned, his aircraft was confiscated, and for the next year the whole crew was moved around the Soviet Union to different camps, till finally, on the Persian border, they managed to bribe some guards, got over the border, and finally got back to the States in May 1943.
4 of the B-25s crash-landed. The crews of 11 others bailed out, with many suffering grazes, cuts, and in some cases broken bones. 1 airman was killed in the parachute jump. 4 others were drowned. On reaching the ground safely, like their drenched commander, most decided to stay put until first light. He and the rest of his crew made their way down to a village at dawn, where they were well treated and eventually reached the safety of Chongqing. Another B-25 was less fortunate. Running out of fuel, it came down in the China Sea off Ningpo. 3 of the crew swam ashore, but were captured by the pro-Japanese Chinese. The entire crew of another Mitchell, which bailed out, were caught by Japanese soldiers. Learning of their plight before he left China, Doolittle made strenuous efforts to secure the release of his men, even considering bribing a local warlord to attempt a rescue mission. His efforts came to nothing. All 8 prisoners were tried and sentenced to death. 5 had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment. 3 were executed for inhuman acts. Another died in captivity. Of the 80 airmen who took part in the Doolittle raid, 71 survived the war. From the 16 B-25s which left Hornet on the 18th of April, only 1 made a 3-point landing at Vladivostok. The impact of the mission throughout the United States was dramatic, hitting the Japanese mainland a tremendous morale boost. Exuberant headlines included, "Doolittle doed it," and in the Alaskan town where he spent his childhood, "Nome Town boy makes good." Despite the virtual news blackout, the catastrophe of an air raid on Tokyo gradually spread in Japan, and Roosevelt's taunting claim that the aircraft had come from mythical Shangri-La added further insult. At length, the Japanese admitted to the public that several enemy planes had bombed the Tokyo-Yokohama area, but had been driven off with the loss of 9 aircraft. Damage to our side appears to be slight. The imperial household is safe. But for the Japanese military authorities, the implications were worrying. The potential for greater destructive attacks had to be thwarted. Yamamoto therefore determined to seek a final showdown with the Pacific Fleet, not knowing that the Imperial Navy's code had been broken. His angry response would unwittingly hazard the Japanese fleet and cost him his own life.
After Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto realized that he would have to neutralize the American aircraft carriers if they were not to launch attacks upon the Japanese mainland and indeed the Japanese possessions. So he devised a plan in June 1942 whereby a task force would seize the American island of Midway and entice the Americans then to try and recapture it. When they tried to recapture it, he would have 8 aircraft carriers off the Midway, which would then annihilate the American Air Force or air capacity, and that would then enable him to get command of the sea in the Pacific. Didn't quite work out that way. What he didn't know was that the Japanese naval code had been broken by the Americans and they knew what his plans were. So although he sent a decoy fleet up to the Aleutian Islands, they were ready waiting for him, and the result was that he lost 4 of his aircraft carriers and 322 aircraft. It was therefore decisive. It was one of the decisive battles in the Pacific. Yamamoto himself was depressed by this, and in the following year, in 1943, again not knowing that the Americans had broken the Japanese naval code, he was on a tour of inspection when they shot him down.
Apart from serving the short-term purpose of avenging Pearl Harbor, the Doolittle raid signaled the death knell of Yamamoto's dream of a negotiated peace with the United States, and demonstrated that the Japanese homeland was vulnerable to aerial attack. It was the forerunner of the massive strategic bombing campaign waged on Japan by B-29 bombers from the Mariana Islands in 1944 and 1945, and ultimately the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Returning to the United States, Doolittle was deservedly awarded the Medal of Honor. He claimed that the award in reality recognized the achievements of his entire intrepid band, and he wrote personally to the families of every man who had flown off Hornet with him. Those to the relatives of the men in captivity, whose fate at that time remained unknown, were the most difficult to compose. Mounted by crews, few of whose members had previously seen action, and none of whom had taken off from an aircraft carrier even under calm peacetime conditions, who were led by a commander not trained as a bomber pilot, the Doolittle raid was truly an epic achievement. Their flight was one of the most courageous deeds in all military history. Admiral Halsey.